Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the third edition of cross-regional events on online platforms, platform work, and platform workers, organized by FES Future of Work in Brussels, in cooperation with FES France, Greece, and Italy. I'm John Paul Judson, and delighted to be with you today to moderate this session. It's a working session where we will be sharing insights and experiences on the status and responsibilities of digital platforms when it comes to working practices and working conditions, but also the broader effects of these new models of work on employment rights and obligations, the protection of workers' rights, and the modus operandi of trade unions. In this session, you will be hearing from experiences in France, Greece, Italy, and Germany. In the first part, we'll be joined by country experts who will provide information on the characteristics of platform work and give us a sense of some of the analyses that they have made on their national levels. And in the second part, we will have a panel focusing on aspects of governance in relation to appropriate policy responses and the role of trade unions in protecting the rights of platform workers. In terms of housekeeping, the English version of the event will be recorded and the videos published on the FES website. A mail with the links will be sent to all participants. There is also interpretation available in German, English, French, Greek, and Italian. So all you need to do is click on the interpretation button and select your preferred language. I take this opportunity also as a shout out to interpreters. I always say they are the building blocks of the European Union. Without them, it would be very difficult for us to communicate. So thanks a lot for them. And to all the speakers, please be sure not to speak too fast to allow the interpreters to keep up, with your rhythm. The audience can also ask questions via the Q&A tool. You can also ask questions in the different languages, English, German, French, Greek, or Italian. The multilingual team at FES will be there to translate. And before I introduce the speakers of the first panel, I'd like to invite Oliver Philipp to say a few words. He is Policy Officer at the Friedrich Ebert Stiftung's Competence Center on the Future of Work based in Brussels, and he's put a lot of effort in the organization of this session. So Oliver, some words from you.
Yes, thank you very much, Jean-Paul. Dear ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues, it is with a great pleasure that I warmly welcome you also on behalf of the Competence Center Future of Work of the Friedrich Ebert Stiftung to this third edition of our online events on platform work in different European countries. After focusing last year on Nordic countries, Spain, Portugal, Romania, and Germany, I'm really looking forward to the discussion today on the platform economy in France, Greece, Italy, and Germany. And I also would like to give a special welcome to our speakers for today. It is really great to have you here, and thank you very much for accepting our invitation. So this event is organized in cooperation with the Friedrich Ebert Stiftung offices in France, Greece, and Italy. And so also on their behalf, I welcome you very warmly to this event today. And without them, it wouldn't be possible to organize this event. So also a big thank you to them. And before we start, I just had a quick look at the participant list. And I see that a lot of people are, of course, coming from France, Italy, Greece, and Germany, which makes us very happy. But I'm also happy to see that a lot of participants are coming from other countries. And I think it shows that the regulation of online platforms and how to protect platform workers is currently discussed in a lot of European countries. And of course, one reason why the topic moved into focus is the proposal of the European Commission for a directive on improving working conditions in platform work, which is, as you, of course, are aware of, discussed in the European Council. So I want to be very, very short, but please allow me very briefly to just explain to you the intention behind today's event. So we at the Competence Center Future of Work, we are aiming to go beyond the current debate on the directive, focusing mainly on the employment status of platform workers. And we were interested in understanding how online platforms are changing the nature of work in different countries. And this is also why we started last year the research project Mapping Platform Economy in Europe. The aim was to give an overview of the existing platform economy in over 30 countries, and to also shed some light on the complexity by providing a visualization of several regulatory aspects of platform work. So, for example, we collected data and created maps that give you an overview about in which countries an official definition of online platforms exists, or where collective agreements at sectoral, regional, or company level exist. And we will also share the link to the website with you in the chat, I'm sure about this. But while collecting all this data in these countries, we realized that there are many differences between the countries regarding public discourse or national regulations for the protection of platform workers. And this is, of course, also the case for the countries we discussed today. And the second aspect we realized is that much still remains unknown when it comes to platform companies, when it comes to platform work. So we believe that for the current political debate on regulating platform economy, it is very helpful to also look across, to look with a cross-regional perspective on platform work in different countries. So that's what we want to do today. And I think with France, Greece, Italy, and Germany, we have very interesting countries today. And I'm really looking forward to the debate. So I will stop here to have enough time. And I wish all of us a great debate. Thank you all for joining today. And thank you very much. Jean-Paul, I hand over back to you.
Okay, thanks, Oliver. Thank you for these contextual words and opening remarks. So I propose that we go straight down to it. What are the main characteristics of platform work in the 4 countries that we have highlighted today? To discover a little bit more, I'd like to invite our 4 first panelists for the first session. Odile Chagny is an economist, a statistician at IRES, the Economic and Social Research Institute serving trade union organizations in France. Odile, welcome. We have...
Merci beaucoup, bonjour.
Bonjour. We have for Greece, Mr. Manos Matsaganis. He is a professor of public finance at Polytechnic University of Milan, but he will be speaking for Greece today. Welcome, Manos. For Italy, we have Ivana Pais. Ivana is professor in economic sociology at Università Cattolica del Sacro Cuore. Yeah, I got that one just about right. Welcome, Ivana. And for Germany, we have Valentin Niebler. He's a PhD researcher at Humboldt University of Berlin. And in the last years, he's worked on the EU Horizon 2020 project, Platform Labor in Urban Spaces, which has compared platform labor in 7 European countries. So a highly informed panel we have here. So welcome to all of you. To get us started, I'd like to ask you to just give us an impression about the platform economy in your country. Can you maybe describe some aspects of it in terms of, number of platforms, number of users, a bit of data, effectively, just so we get a sense of context? Can I go to Odile first for France?
Merci beaucoup. Je vais essayer de parler lentement pour faciliter le travail.
Thank you. I'll try to speak slowly to facilitate the work of interpreters because I've decided to speak in my native language because it's a topic I work on, of course, in my native tongue. You ask a very interesting question, Jean-Paul, especially in the context of the very important work that was done by the Foundation to pull together the information on how work on platforms is evolving in different countries. And when I looked at the data, the figures that we have, and I try to take stock of it, what we realize is that in this sector, things are invisible. they're made invisible, and that there is really a need to keep a constant focus on it and to think collectively at better ways to try to determine the scope, the size of jobs involved. Why do I say this? Because when we try to measure the number of workers on platforms and active platforms in France, well, for a very long time in France, we thought that there was somewhere around 200,000 people working on platforms. This was a figure that remained fairly constant according to sources. And since the mid 2000s and even until about mid 2020. And the general impression or consensus was there were about 100 active platforms. And then at different times, there was a large focus on this. And I think the draft directive and the impact studies that went along with it made it possible to better understand what was going on. And in France, we also have the electoral process on some platforms, especially the platform for mobility, that made it possible to make an exhaustive sort of inventory of who was working on these platforms. And we came up with very different figures. So I think that's very important at least in our French context. We were thinking there were about 200,000 workers. Now, if I look at the study that was carried out for the European Commission impact study, we actually have the number of 800,000. Then if I look at the number of platforms, we thought there was about 100 platforms. Now, if we look at the more recent data from the studies of the European Commission, we have about 250 to 300 active platforms. So all of these new platforms, especially the freelance ones, some people are even talking about 30,000 small platforms if you look at everything that exists out there in that universe. I think I'll stop here and let my colleagues speak. But what I want to focus is that there is one thing that's very complex to measure, is the actual volume of business or volume of activity that this involves. Why? Because it's made invisible because we have inadequate public statistics, and because a lot of it is dependent on self-reporting of the economic actors. And this is a sector where growth is exponential over time.
Yeah, growth is exponential, and at the same time, at the expense of platform workers. And I'd like to keep this idea of making figures invisible. Maybe that's something that other panelists could react to as well. Could we then go to Greece with Manos? Can you give us a bit of a picture of the situation in Greece?
Thank you very much. My name is Manos Matsaganis, and I'm a professor at the University of Milan. The picture in Greece regarding figures is a bit unclear, given that we don't have very good data. We know things from publications and press, etc., that at least in the sector of food delivery, the drivers, the riders, are a few hundreds of individuals working in each of the 2 or 3 businesses active in food delivery, e-food, Volt, etc. Could be summed up to 500 to 1,000 people delivering food at home. A few years ago, there were also workers online. We had Uber workers, drivers. It was some sort of taxi drivers. Approximately 1,300 people were working there, some of whom were also freelancers. Others would work exclusively for Uber, but ever since 2019, Uber is no longer in Greece. It has left Greece since the previous government created a new institutional framework that did not allow for the business to have profits. So we're talking about large businesses employees because, well, I refer to food delivery because there could be thousands or hundreds of thousands of neighborhood restaurants or other food stores that cooperate with one driver each. I don't know if you want me to speak about the latest developments in the institutional framework, or should we leave that for later?
I think we can take that one later. Yeah. What I understand is that it's a sector that has not developed because of a specific law that made it very difficult to make profits out of it. So the big players are not really in Greece, and you have a more atomized sector. Is that how I could characterize it?
I think that legislation is hostile due to the mobilization of the taxi drivers union regarding the Uber platforms, whereas there is a big growth in the food delivery sector.
Okay, yeah, understood. Thank you for that clarification. Then let's go to Italy. Ivana, can you give us a sense of the overall picture in Italy?
Grazie. Italia. Allora,
well, thank you. And as far as Italy is concerned,
abbiamo gli stessi problemi. Scusate, devo togliere la traduzione, altrimenti
let me just turn the
sento la
interpretation
traduzione
off, otherwise I
delle mie parole.
hear our interpreter instead of myself.
Non riesco a toglierle.
Done. Apologies for that. Well then, as far as Italy is concerned, we also have a hard time measuring things, just similar to other countries. The more reliable research material we have is the one conducted by INAP on figures regarding 2020 and 2021. And what we understand is that it is a very dynamic sector where things can change over a 1 or 2 year period. Therefore, when it comes to, I can give you some information on the figures regarding 2020, and then I could also mention how platform work has changed currently. The figures pertaining to 2020 and 2021 state that 5.2% of Italians in those years were making a living on digital platforms, but that includes all kinds of digital platforms, including renting out your home, for instance. 1.3% of Italians did do platform work. So strictly speaking, it was 1.3%. 570,000 people in total. And a figure which can be interesting to note is that half of these people declared that they conducted platform work as their main job, as their main occupation. In 2020, we had 36% rather, who made home deliveries of food. 14% would deliver packages. So all in all, delivery was equal to half of that amount of people. Then we also had roughly 1/3, slightly above 1/3 of those workers, 35% worked online, and 9% worked from home, domestic work. Prior to the pandemic, this amount of domestic workers or home workers was much higher. And there were many more compared to delivery workers, whereas with the pandemic, homework, domestic work, even on platforms, dropped. Very briefly, let me go over the things I'm currently seeing. What I'm seeing is a significant increase in certain types of online professions or online jobs. For instance, in Italy, we've had a very strong growth in psychological or online psychological consulting services. So we have plenty of psychologists who work online nowadays. We have plenty of platforms offering this kind of service, including platforms which are also receiving major funding. Similarly, we're also seeing a growth in certain qualified professions on platforms. Besides psychologists, we're also seeing many physicians. We're seeing plenty of medical consulting services online. And then in general, we have care work, caregivers, very many caregivers, many babysitters. In a research I conducted, I mapped the Italian platforms operating in the education and infant care services, social assistance services, and physical and mental health services. And we came up with 130 platforms, roughly, in Italy, offering these types of services. And we can come back to this later, maybe, but let me just conclude by saying that there seems to be no interest in the public sphere in academic research or in trade union activism for any of these professions. There seems to be no interest whatsoever. The debate is entirely focused on riders. And in fact, it is no coincidence that legislation is only focused on that sphere, which is important, of course, but there is plenty more that we are not focusing on.
And maybe that says something about the opposition that is very specific to that sector, with an established professional body performing that service, as opposed to specifically what these digital platforms do, because there are visibly ways of fighting back, shall we say. Okay, thanks, Ivana, for taking us through that journey of the Italian picture. Can we then go to Germany for an initial overview? Valentin.
Yes, thank you, Jean-Paul. So yeah, it's a good question to start, I think, but also a really tricky one, as has been said already, because yeah, it's hard to measure, even though we are dealing with companies who have lots of data about their workers, probably more than other companies. They're not sharing it, of course, and we don't have access as researchers. So we can only guess to some extent. And I think what also makes it, or estimate, and I think what also makes it very difficult, and what we saw doing qualitative research in Berlin and other cities, was that a lot of the work is sort of semi-formal or informal, which then makes it difficult even to estimate from a research perspective, because it's very difficult to grasp when people are not receiving pay slips, but get cash money, for instance, for their work. But in terms of numbers for Germany, I would say the overall numbers are not very huge. I'm referring, because we did not quantitative work in our study, but referring to a ETUY study from last year, which was very informative, and which talks about 1.6% of the labor force that works more than 20 hours a week on platforms. And then the number is a bit higher for people who earn more than 50% of their income through platforms. But these 1.6% equals sort of around 700,000 workers, roughly, I would say. And yeah, I don't want to say number of platforms. I mean, there are many platforms. I was thinking, what would be important platforms? I would say there are maybe 10 to 15 really important platforms, and most of them are in delivery, and then some of them are in ride-hailing, and then some of them are in domestic cleaning, and in domestic care platforms, which, as Ivana said, are not very much researched. We did a bit of it. I can maybe talk about it later. And to maybe just add one aspect about Germany, I think one specificity is that not only the platform workers are in the country, but also some of the companies have their headquarters in Germany. So Delivery Hero, for instance, who owns Foodora, is based in Germany. Gorillas used to be based there. Also Helpling, a domestic cleaning platform, has its headquarters there, and Lieferando to some extent is also in Berlin. So we also have sort of the software engineers and the office personnel in the country, which sometimes makes a difference for addressing some problems.
But it does mean you're strategically located to claim some data from these companies potentially. Okay, if I go back then to France, because we got a sense of some of the sectors in Greece, in Italy, in Germany. Could you say something about the kind of sectors that are active, well, where platform workers are active in France? And also, maybe what would be a typical profiling of a platform worker in France? I mean, I know that's a very unfair question, but could you give us a sense of a typical aspect of a platform worker in France?
Alors, en fait, ce que je pense qu'on est aussi en train d'exprimer les uns et les autres.
I think that what we're all saying, all of us, is that there's a very moving or flowing characteristic of the platforms and the people working on the platforms, and therefore our ability to measure the phenomenon in terms of volumes, both in terms of income and the actual activity. But what I can say in answer to your question, potentially all sectors can be concerned by the development of platforms. So the picture that you can give at a given date, or on, for instance, in France for mobility, so that's of course transport of persons by car or deliveries, which are the historical sectors. We know that this amounts to 122,000 potential workers. That is to the extent that we can give any kind of an accurate figure. You could talk about retail, the so-called quick commerce, some who appeared and some are actually have gone bankrupt in France, Goyas amongst others, and they represent about 5,000 workers at one point. And there's something that's more of an underlying phenomenon, is more powerful. This is individual services. It could be, for instance, hairdressing in the home, or small jobs, odd jobs done for people at home. And some things that are more continuous, where you have qualified freelance work that is being offered through platforms. And the platforms are not necessarily for unqualified work. And this is something that we really need to bear in mind. Up until now, we always believed that the typical platform worker was a person who was a man, oftentimes or more often than not an immigrant, and not necessarily with the legal documentation, living in sort of disenfranchised neighborhoods, which is true for most of those who are working as drivers. But that was not at all for people working on the platforms for qualified work. So I think it's very important that we not consider that everything that is a freelance work on platform is micro work, that is job work, digital labor, to use a very well-known French sociologist, Antonio Casimi. So we're not just looking at micro work, unqualified digital work. Now we're looking at something that's much broader, and it's large companies that are calling for freelance workers on platforms. And what we've seen in the studies done here in France is that there's a hybrid form that is emerging. So in this context, where in some professional areas there's a lack of manpower, especially in the digital economy, so service providers are used, and they use platforms. So then you have companies who are actually creating their own platforms. For instance, the major digital companies are creating their own platforms. So you have all sectors, for instance, from heavy industry, for instance, automotive industry, going through chemical companies, going all the way to intellectual work, that are using increasingly this type of intermediation. In other words, the ability to call on or to get professional intellectual services. So in the French context, I was referring to 200,000 workers. I was saying for in-mobility or drivers, we had 122,000. But for freelance workers, we're talking of up to 1 million. I don't know if those are true figures, but that's what we're hearing. And we're seeing this a very powerful development of this type of activity.
And there's a comment saying, you know, that according to someone in the audience, you know, that the numbers presented so far are extremely low. But I think you've all also mentioned that there's very little understanding of the real figures. It's very hard to have access to data. Very likely it's higher. And what you're talking about, Odile, is almost like a deeper transformation, right, of the relationship to work in all sectors through digitalization, beyond, in a way, the specifics of digital platforms and platform work. In Greece, Manos, so you were talking about the big development in food delivery service. Before we go into the more legislative aspects, I just would like to understand, do you have an idea of the demographics of platform work in Greece? Do you have any insights on who would be a typical worker in these food deliveries, for instance?
I think that the typical worker is the one that Odile mentioned that we should not have in mind, because in food delivery, this is the guy that we're talking about, a man, usually an immigrant, and not always, of course, because we have many Greeks who can't find a job elsewhere. Therefore, they are employed in food delivery, and they are relatively young people. Of course, what I'm saying pertains only to food delivery sector, which I think is of particular interest. I understand the comments by Ivana and Odile, etc., and I share the same thoughts with them. The issue of the platform is much broader than food delivery, but I think that there's something that distinguishes one case from another. In Greece, too, we have many psychologists providing sessions through the platform. However, the relationship between the consumer and the, let's say, producer, that is the psychologist in this specific case, is a relationship regarding the labor status of the psychologist. Well, this is a pure case of self-employment. This is a self-employed person who, instead of receiving the patients in his or her own practice, he receives them through Zoom. That's okay. But the case of food delivery is something different, because their self-employment is fake. It's bogus self-employment. This is not real. And the scandal over it is that the institutional framework allows it. And even when it is not allowed, it is often violated. Of course, in Greece, it's not allowed. But we're talking about a category of employees who are an object of exploitation. They are, in fact, dependent workers, subordinate employment. They should be taking a wage, but they are paid by the piece. They only have one employer, though, and the law treats them in the same way as it treats psychologists who do sessions online. So I think it's different, and it should be considered by the trade unions. I'm really happy to see here the representative of CGIL in Greece. There is no trade union. They have made their own trade union. There is no interest from the federation, the General Confederation Association of them. I think it's a category of employees who work under risky conditions. Many of them lose their lives or they are injured. They get their pay only when they work, when they are able to work. Their companies unilaterally change the conditions and clauses of their contracts, and employees can do nothing about it except for strike. Only last week we had such a strike, and the business of food delivery, Volt, whose employers went on strike. I see that we have 5,000 riders working in this company, and 3/4 of them are freelancers, supposedly, and many of them are working for subcontractors. There are people who get a contract with Bolt, for instance, and they find riders for them, and you can imagine the low pay for riders, since we have the intermediaries that want to be paid. All this has to stop, but the institutional framework allows that. So I'll put a full stop here, and I do apologize.
No, thank you. I mean, I think it's an important point on this bogus self-employment, because, you know, as a freelance, I mean, I'm a freelance to some extent, but I own the service that I'm providing, and so therefore I own the risk of that service. In the context of platform work, you own the risk, but you don't really own the service that you're delivering. So it does put you in a slightly different situation of being at risk, actually. Ivana, maybe a comment on this bogus self-employment question compared to freelance more generally, and then, yeah, a sense of the typical platform worker in Italy.
Sì, su questo io vorrei tornare un po' sul punto.
Yes, I would like to go back to this point, because at least in Italy, a lot has been done, a lot has been said with respect to riders in the food delivery sector. But we have come to a stage where we have to keep working in this respect, but we have to broaden our horizon. What's the profile of the typical platform worker in Italy? Well, there's been a lot to say about the typical profile of platform workers. There's the profile that is told by platforms, and then there's the very different profile of workers in different sectors. There are many profiles to consider. And I must say that some colleagues of mine are carrying out some very interesting work regarding the image of riders that are represented by unions, because in the light of a very different framework of workers' profiles, it's also interesting to see how they're pictured. So this is a question also for the following panel. Which among those profiles are truly represented by unions? In the public's mind, a platform worker is the one we see in the agenda. Maybe the color of the skin changes. Well, in reality, we've got many riders' profiles with many different needs and many different profiles of platform workers. It seems to me it is not by accident that attention was focused on those who ride along our streets with very visible jackets, whereas no one looked at invisible work they are carrying out. And it is not by accident that that invisible work is carried out by women and not by men. And these workers are always, always invisible. I'm referring to caregivers, carers, or women that carry out clean work in private residences, and it's mostly women. There are no freelancers. They are working off the book through platforms. They don't even have a contract, or at least most of them. They run risks exactly like riders do, because even domestic work entails risks for their health, for their safety. I've interviewed men and women that through platforms receive the address of a home. They go there, they get in, and they don't even know what they're going to find there or whom they're going to find there. So there are risks that are probably less visible than a car crash, but as severe, as dangerous. And no one says anything about it. And of course, there's a big gender gap in these professions, and it's not something that happens by accident. I would like to stress that point. Anyway, platforms are being differentiated right now. So platform models are changing. For example, with respect to domestic work or for caregivers that take care of the elderly, there are platforms that actually do not finalize contracts. Everything is off the book. And there are platforms that don't do contracts, but they make sure that the family actually formalizes a contract with a caregiver. So let's say that the family has a contract in place with a platform, and there are platforms, fewer, of course, but interesting to probe into, that actually take care of the contract. So there are many interesting opportunities. Because when we think about caregiving, which is a pretty fragmented sector, often there are no contracts. It is very difficult to ascertain that the employment relationship is actually protected and legal. There are some big aggregators of work, and this simplifies the work for unions, because there's a place, for example, with respect to caregiving for carers, where there's a company that brings them all together. Whereas until present day, it has been way more fragmented. It was just based on word of mouth. And so way more difficult to verify contract terms or contractual terms. And then there are all the problems we are still aware of, but at least it's a starting point. It's a starting point. It also facilitates collective action.
Yeah, I think this point on contractual arrangements is interesting, because that's clearly something where pressure can be put, although these contracts are more difficult to regulate than typical employment contracts that are part of a broader social dialogue. Let's say here you're in this borderline freelance contract arrangement that could be considered free market or up to the free market only. So maybe that's something to discuss. Valentin, in Germany, can you give us a sense, the typical profile?
Yes, sure. I mean, yeah, as everyone else said, it's not too typical, but I will give two examples and then maybe also say a bit about the contractual arrangements. So for Uber, which we researched a bit in Berlin, I would say one typical profile could be second generation Turkish-German family father who drives 50 or 55 hours a week. Yeah, something like that. So yeah, a lot of people with family responsibilities and also older, like, I don't know, 30, 40 plus. No? And then for Helpling, this domestic cleaning platform, for instance, is totally different. So there we actually spoke to more men than women, surprisingly. And also the platform, kind of what they gave us was like kind of a 50-50 ratio. So it was kind of a surprising difference to what we think of domestic cleaning platforms. And the constituency was also interesting, because it's usually then typical profile would then be a man, a young, well-educated man, maybe with a master's degree from Argentina or Chile, who came through a specific visa study, work and study kind of visa to Germany to maybe stay longer or to just stay for a while. But very specific arrangement, like Chile, Argentina, very highly educated, and then they work on these platforms and sometimes also connect with the customers kind of through their background. That's at least one constituency on this platform. And then I think one important thing to add about German platform economy is that in the beginning we had all these freelancer like topics, and it's still the case for domestic cleaning. But for all the other labor platforms, actually the on-site labor platforms, we have employment contracts. So officially, at least, they are sort of proper or less proper employment contracts, and the companies kind of, and I think something that also happened due to the struggles of workers, that this could be established. But what we then found out when we looked at what actually happens is that, I mean, there's no bogus self-employment, but like what we found was more like a bogus employment, like kind of a false employment. Like the for instance, the Uber drivers we would talk to, they would have an employment contract, but the conditions, to some extent, they maybe would have insurance. They maybe would have not their own car, so they would not have to pay for damage, but they had piece wages. They often had no holiday pay, and all the things that usually would come with an employment contract. So I think, I mean, for us at least, that was kind of a lesson to not focus maybe too much on the employment contract as something that makes the entire difference. Because since the labor market liberalizations in the 2000s, at least in Germany, it's possible to really sabotage an employment contract. And that's exactly what companies are doing. And yeah, I think that should be taken, there should be attention on that.
Okay, no, yeah, thanks. We take notes. It's a shame because you would like to be able to work on the basis of a contract, but understood. It's easily sabotaged, and the power play is not necessarily always in favor of workers, especially when they're less organized. If I just turn to Greece, just to go a little bit deeper on the regulatory and labor law framework. So you have a new labor law that came into force in 2021. Protecting platform workers, providing a definition also of digital platforms. Can you tell us something about that, and where do you see improvement in this direction for platform workers?
Yes, with pleasure. Now, the law of 2021 was drafted to a certain extent in order for the Greek government to be able to tell the EU in the public discourse that it complies with the ruling of the European Court. I'm referring to a ruling of the EU on April 2020, according to which one is not a salaried worker. Therefore, the employer may treat you as a freelancer if there are, of course, specific conditions that are met. If you can give work to someone else as a subcontractor, if you can choose whether you're going to accept food delivery or not, if you are able to work for a competitor of the business that hires you, and if you're able to select the working days and hours. This is in the court ruling, and this is what is drafted in the Greek law 2021. What is omitted in the Greek law is another point from the EU court ruling, that there need to be two general conditions that should be met. The independence of the employee should be real and not fictitious. And the second condition is for the employee not to be subordinate to the employer. It is obvious that in the case of the delivery riders in Greece and other countries, it's both fictitious self-employment, there is no independence, and the employee is indeed a subordinate employee. Despite that, after that law, it is absolutely legal, and this is what actually happens, for one to get paid on a piece-by-piece basis and to be considered as freelancers. So in case they're sick, they get sick, or if they have a road accident, many of them have road accidents, traffic accidents, and 20 have died in the past 3 years. So they're on their own, and your colleagues will have to help you. So Volt or eFood have no liability whatsoever. I'm referring to Volt's employees that are 5,000. So things are unfavorable for the employees. I'm referring to Volt because nowadays workers for Volt are on strike. They went on strike a few days ago. Three-fourths of them are considered freelancers, and many of them are working for a subcontractor. It's a Middle Ages scheme. Now, many of the rest of the workers are are undeclared workers. The reason for the strike is not just that. This was something that was true in the past, but also now. The reason is that after COVID, when their sales dropped, Volta changed the algorithm calculating the remuneration of the riders. And according to the employees' claims, the fee has dropped by 40% unilaterally, and they cannot do anything about it. And it is not yet clarified how this algorithm has come to change. So many of them observe that although in the past they could have, for instance, 45 years in 4 hours time, which is not bad for the labor conditions in Greece. Nowadays, they find it hard to meet their expenses. And now their claim for the strike is that protective equipment should be paid by the company and not by the employees themselves. So you can understand that this is how the situation is in Greece. And I think that here the law just legalized or legitimized something that was taking place in the past. Things were even worse in the past. In neighborhood stores, etc., things are even worse. It has been written in the press that if a neighborhood restaurant employing just one rider for food delivery, if this person gets into a road accident, a traffic accident, what happens actually is that the employer goes to the site of the accident and tries to make the bicycle disappear, the bike disappear. Whatever may link the restaurant to the driver is getting off the way. The owner tries to make it disappear so as for the police not to be able to say that this person was employed by the specific restaurant. So this is how things are. And I'm really sorry that there is not such a major discussion of that, because it's a social issue.
Yeah, and one gets to see also that the sabotage, let's say, of responsibility is not specific to digital platforms in this example, but more generally to employment to some extent. Odile, in France, the discussion is also focusing on this question of employment status, legal framework for social dialogue. Can you give us some insights on the discussions in France on platform work in terms of policy, regulation?
Alors, la situation française, c'est une situation qui est effectivement très spécifique. Pardon, excusez-moi.
The French situation is very specific, which, apologies, I'll be right with you. We have a French voice, or I'm sorry, a French way or French path, which is very specific in the EU context, which I didn't say earlier, is that there's a policy choice that the workers with intermediation on platforms, when the platform exercise some form of a control as set out by the law. So here we're talking primarily about drivers and riders, the 122,000 that we were talking about earlier. So for these people, we consider that they are independent, in that meaning to say that they're freelance, so that they'll be granted some basic rights that was determined in 2016. And the social dialogue is going to be allowed to work, and people are going to be entrusted with the ability to negotiate agreements. This is the French way, as promoted by the state, the government. And of course, this has an impact on France's position when it comes to the draft directive on platform workers. So this way, even the French context is, of course, not exempt of contradictions, because you have regulation coming from legislatures, and then whatever regulation comes from the courts. There's a lot of contradictions. I don't need to go through all the cases that we've accumulated, but just as a reminder, in France, there was one case where somebody was sentenced, and it was a criminal case. It was Deliveroo that was sentenced for a criminal violation. And this is of the Paris's criminal court. So we have case law or jurisprudence that's accumulating, and it's going towards requalifying the service contract into a work contract. And the most latest case was in January of 2023, where 139 drivers were requalified as regular workers. So we're seeing something that's happening through social dialogue. And it seems that the government or the state is really relying on the social dialogue. So what happened in France? Of course, there were elections that took place in May 2022. The next round of elections will take place in 2 years, that is in 2024. And we're seeing agreements being signed. We have so far 6 agreements that either have been signed or that are in the pipeline. This is for personal transport or delivery. And there's an organ that has been set up to regulate platforms, and they have resources made available to actors in the social dialogue. There's a team. There are resources. In other words, training is done for people who participate in this social dialogue. It's late, and of course we have the next panel, so I don't want to take up too much time. But what conclusions can we draw? We're not saying that we're creating the right modalities for the social dialogue for it to be truly balanced. And that's something that I would like to stress. First of all, the legitimacy of the actors and the loyalty of these actors and the ability that they have to negotiate balanced agreements. Because in the French context, the question of legitimacy of the actors is really important because let's be honest, the low level of those who go out and vote, or the low level of trade unions that were willing to participate. And so this, of course, raises the whole question of how legitimate these actors are. But we still have elected representatives, and they have signed agreements. The agreements are interesting because they set out minimal remuneration and the modalities. How can one negotiate? When is it done? With what information? And there was an agreement on how to deactivate, another one on how to deconnection. And finally, I'd like to say that the government is really thinking about transparency. That is, to what degree is that dialogue faithful? To what degree do we have sufficient information to actually measure what effect an agreement can have? Because in this context, even if there's an obligation to give information, to give statistics and data, that is to say the platforms are under the obligation to give data, and this is since the law we adopted in 2019. In actual fact, we don't have a lot of information that would enable us to say this agreement is having an impact or is not having an impact. So is there a bite in this agreement? That's the term that we use. Does this agreement have some bite to it? And then the question is, are we able to negotiate agreements or not? If we cannot rebalance the negotiating powers of the actors, and we're only relying on the ability of weak actors to sign agreements. And this is why we see that it's necessary to have other ways to conduct the dialogue, for instance, requalifying people's status. Thank you.
Perfect. Thanks for that overview and the link between, the legislation, but also case law building up. And maybe that's also a topic in itself, just picking up all the different case law across Europe and trying to make sense of that could also be interesting. Ivana, in Italy, you had a decree looking at a voluntary agreement between several platforms in the delivery sector. Can you tell us something about that, and what was it actually trying to achieve in terms of improving worker conditions? I'd have to ask you to try and be quite brief, maybe 2 or 3 minutes maximum.
Vado per parole chiave. Provo.
Let me just focus on some key words. Yes, we do have a decree regarding riders, which is leading to a kind of an interesting experiment, as I was mentioning, to see how that can be applied to other professions. That is a case which refers to Just Eat specifically, the Just Eat platform, and it provides for working as a rider with an employee status. But this goes back to what we were mentioning for Germany, on working conditions and on waivers to contracts. This is important for riders, but it can also become important for all other workers, because the same kind of situation is also happening for domestic workers or caregivers. So it's important. Then we also have the rulings, another issue that Odile mentioned, which is important for Italy as well. And let me mention a fact or something we may be underestimating. The rulings are also important to get to know these companies. We have a number of Italian colleagues who have conducted very interesting research, which started from the documents that they collected during rulings and controversies. And they used the interceptions, the phone tappings of all the material that was used to come up with the rulings, similar to what is done with organized crime. And they're using this material to get to know these companies because, as we mentioned earlier, we know nothing about these companies. Even we researchers have a hard time accessing our field of research. So having access to the documents made available for controversies, for legal controversies, even for we researchers, is something which I think is very promising in terms of getting to know how these organizations function. Finally, besides the voice, we also have ways of coming up with alternative business models. On the international level, there has been plenty of discussions on platform cooperativism and on alternative forms of business. There was a discussion on our chat on how we can design these platforms. And I believe that these movements are underestimating the design the platforms have in mind. The platform cooperativism that wants to simply cut and paste the infrastructure of the digital platforms with a cooperative type of governance above that, what I think they're doing is that they're underestimating the fact that their technology limits their ability to intervene on the platform. Now, from this point of view, what we're seeing in Italy, especially in the care services, which is what I'm studying now because it's so interesting, and I'm almost done, what we're seeing is plenty of cooperatives which already existed creating platforms. So instead of starting from the platforms and turning to the cooperatives, what we're seeing is the cooperatives creating platforms are going from cooperatives to platforms. To me, that is very interesting if it allows us to think about how we can design different types of platforms, given the fact that we will already start from a type of governance, which is the one that cooperatives use. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, interesting points, almost reverse sabotage when it comes to court rulings to some extent, and then also using existing governance types and applying those to the digital world as opposed to importing governance models imposed by digital platforms. Interesting. And we'll be taking up some of these governance aspects in the next panel. I'd like to just go to Valentin for a last word also in terms of regulatory response, let's say, in Germany. Can you give us a sense of what is happening?
Yeah, I mean, there are some, yeah, like as I said before already, like we already moved in Germany a bit from this self-employment status towards the employment status. So that's something that already happened. And there are some sort of key points that the Ministry of Labor developed a few years ago, which mainly focuses on some of the issues that have been mentioned now already. And I think one of interesting of them is maybe to ensure social protection also for the remaining freelancers that are there. So if we have sort of a freelance platform relationship, how to still make sure that social protection exists, because at least in Germany, social protection is very much related to a dependent employment relationship. So that's, I think, one regulatory debate. And then I think what's maybe also interesting is that, and this will be talked about with unions maybe later, is that there are now moves towards collective agreements in Germany in the delivery sector, which just happened in April for the first time. And also a discussion about the strike laws in Germany, which some of you maybe know are very conservative, and it's very, very difficult to strike. And this whole relation of migrant workers and unions, I think, came up through many of the grassroots actions that happened in the last years. And they posed this question of what happens if unions and workers don't really come along, but it's prohibited to strike without a union. What happens then? And there were some couple of court cases and sort of political movements towards that direction, which I think is interesting to keep in mind or to look at.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. I think you've shared a lot of information, even though there is this concept of making information invisible in this area. You're doing a good job at least trying to peek under the carpet to see what's out there. So good luck in your continued research in this field. I think we'll turn to the policy panel now, but obviously the policy panel will definitely require, data, information, analysis to make, informed decisions. So keep up the good work, and thank you so much for having been with us. So that was panel one. I'll make a very smooth transition, also just to get the interpreters to get 1 minute of breathing. But I think we've already come through a long way. We've got some interesting 4 national perspectives, 4 insights into countries. We see it's complex. They all mentioned that there's very little information available. But there are some options, there are some opportunities, there are some court rulings that do provide some information. And there are some ideas as to what kind of governance structures could be better to protect workers in this platform work field. So this is what we're going to discuss now in the second panel. So if you're ready, let's go straight down to it. So I would like to invite our next set of panelists. I'll start with Mr. Olivier Jacquin. Olivier is a French politician. Since March 1989, he's held various elective offices in the French department of Meurthe-et-Moselle before being elected senator on September 2017. And he's a member of the Socialist Party since the 1990s. Welcome, Olivier. We have... Bonjour. Welcome. We have Georgios Christopoulos. He is the president of the Federation of Private Teachers in Greece. He's also the chief executive officer of the Center of Education Policy Development of the General Confederation of Greek Workers. Georgios, thanks for being here. We have Nicolas Marongiu. Nicolas is member of the CGIL National Executive Committee and responsible for collective bargaining and labor market policy. He's a member of ETUC, Labour Market Committee, and the Working Group for Non-Standard Workers. Nicolas, welcome to you. And finally, we have Roman Korman. Roman works at the German Trade Union Confederation and Department of Political Strategy and Future of Work. He's responsible for digital work in particular, and his focus is on the European level, on the Directive on Platform Work and the European Artificial Intelligence Law. So let's start talking about policy responses. Okay, so we've heard different perspectives in the four countries that we've highlighted. What are, according to you, some of the main challenges regarding platform work in your country? Olivier, maybe I go to you first. Odile mentioned the fact that companies had an interest in making data invisible. Do you see this as one of the big challenges, and how do you view this in France?
Oui, le défi principal, c'est
The main challenge is, can you hear me well? May I continue? As I was saying, I'm in a very unusual country that deliberately supports the platforms more than those who work on the platforms. And what I'm saying is borne out by the facts. And the investigation on Uber showed that the government and through its ministers had supported the great digital platforms, and the platform even said, following the investigation on the Uber files, that this is were to be done again, he would do the same thing. So we're in this very unusual or specific context since 2017, when, to put it clearly, the government has been encouraging the creation of case law, of jurisprudence, to de facto get to the creation of a third status. It would a new status somewhere between that of employee, a wage earner, and a freelancer. But the question of invisibility that you talked about is such that most of the discussion is going on around drivers and riders, but this is the tree in the forest of digital workers, where workers and companies are questioning the whole subordination relationship, and a very strong confusion between the question of autonomy and being freelance, because in terms of status, these are two different things. So that is the context, and this is also a response to your first question. And of course, I have a bias because, of course, I am on the side of the protection of workers.
Yep, understood. A political support in principle to the business model, basically, and that's a challenge in France. Nicolas, for Italy, what do you see as being really the biggest challenge, and where you really need to respond on a policy level?
Bisogna rendere molto.
Well, we have to strengthen the laws we have. We have to strengthen legislation. The data we heard in the previous panel are common to many different countries. And we also share the same types of problems. We have invisibility and a difficulty to regulate these workers, given the current labor laws we have, which means that we truly have to strengthen the obligations companies have in terms of providing information, the communication they make regarding the workers that use digital platforms, so that these activities can be traced, so that they can be mapped by the social protection organizations, such as the Ministry of Labor, for instance. In Italy, in one sector, we have made some significant progress, but I agree with Professor Pais. We only talk about riders. We're only a small part of platform workers, meaning that we really should broaden our analysis. But again, prosecutors did a lot in terms of improving conditions of workers. Mostly because, initially speaking, what we saw was that platforms weren't employers, so they have no legal obligations towards workers, but they aren't even a labor intermediary. They aren't recognized as labor agencies. What they are is an entity which acts as a broker between supply and demand, and they favor the exchange of a service. It could be labor on the one hand, but it can also be an exchange between private individuals. That too is what platform work is. And therefore, going back to what the European Commission is doing, maybe we have to think about creating a stronger set of rules, stronger set of legislation, not as a way of limiting or stopping platform work, because in some sectors, platform work is an opportunity. As far as caregivers are concerned, it can be an opportunity. And we have the Fair Worth Network, which will be publishing research soon. In that sector, the caregiving sector, there's a lot of demand for professional services, and caregivers can reach out to a larger number of clients. But we need stronger rules, because the currently existing rules, the currently existing legislation, and the collective bargaining capacity we have, and of course, that is another thing that trade unions have to ask themselves. So again, the rules we currently have can't deal with the fact that these types of jobs were created without any rules. That's something we see in all countries. We came up with rules at a later stage, following rulings, following case law, and following the actions to counter certain types of behaviors, especially as far as prosecutors are concerned, as far as Italy is concerned specifically. I'll leave it at that for the time being.
Yeah, because the technology enables also innovation in the business model that goes before the actual rules of the employment market in those sectors, and so that obviously creates a challenge for regulators. In Greece, if I can go, I don't know, is Giorgio still with us? Could we get a sense of the main challenges that you see in Greece?
First of all, allow me to say that it might sound really difficult, but Greece, unfortunately, is no longer a rule of law in the European sense of the term. Fundamental rights, fundamental principles that are valid in the majority of the member states of the European Union are no longer valid in Greece. Let me remind you that there has been the wiretapping issue in Greece, and it has been condemned, and we are in place 107th vis-a-vis the freedom of press. This is a very heavy situation, but I need to admit that the Greek government in the labor issue moves really smartly. They have voted a law 4808 of 2021, whereby there is mention of the digital platform, and there is the unionism that is allowed, but it is to laugh at because the only labor inspectorate that existed has been cancelled, and now it has been turned into an independent authority. This transition into an independent authority status was done on purpose in order for the employers to do what they wanted in the meantime in the labor market. Let me give you the example of my own federation. We have teachers who are under the supervision of the Ministry of Labor and the Ministry of Education. In 6 months' time, we have had 50 complaints that we have applied for. The authority accepted only to investigate 2, and there were no sanctions to the employers. Let me talk about platform work for educators in Greece. This is broadly developing, particularly following the pandemic, where we had the digital education services. Digital education services through platforms are seen in 2 areas. In the private courses, what we call frontisteria. Well, we're talking about supportive teaching for secondary education students. We have teachers, professors assisting students in their homework, and also we have foreign language teachers who work in that way. So we have found 2 things through complaints that we have received in the past few months, because this is very new, all very new to Greece, and we have to deal with that as a union, trying to see how we can organize educators and on how we can move to put an end to this arbitrary ruling. We have had calls a few months ago from educators who were working in digital platforms, education platforms, and they told us that they get 1.5 euro per hour. But it's not just that. We found out, following discussions with other educators, that there are three forms of employment. The big majority of educators working at digital platforms work in the gray economy. They do not pay social security contributions, they do not pay taxes, and of course it's bad for the employees themselves because they cannot establish their pension rights. A second category of workers is the one mentioned in the first panel. We're talking about the bogus self-employed, and the third category is only a small minority which is seen in a specific branch for foreign languages, is people who work in digital platforms, and they are remunerated as per the physical presence educators. A short while ago, we had a complaint by parents who wanted to get digital services for education for the children, and they tried to pay this company, and we found out that there was no bank account details provided, and following protests by parents, they were given a bank account that was in a foreign country. So here there's a case of a company that in fact operates as a ghost company. No one knows who works there, whether they are educators, whether they have the typical qualifications that would allow them to teach, whether they are allowed to offer such services. We don't know anything about their remuneration. However, there was an effort to inform the Greek authorities on the presence of such services. This issue was also undertaken by the General Confederation of Workers of Greece. However, as is usually the case in the past 3 to 4 years in this country, the state is unwilling to check and control the employer's arbitrary behavior and unlawfulness. To make a long story short, people who are working in platforms and education are completely unprotected. They don't have social security. We calculate that these people amount to 500, but we believe that only 20. We cannot hear. We hear. Well, you know, it is very difficult for a sector to sign a collective agreement because we're talking about a very small sector. So education is a small sector, therefore we cannot have collective agreements. And this is more or less the picture in Greece. It's a dystopic picture. It's unpleasant.
Thank you, George. I mean, you're painting a picture of a more general absence of protection, absence of regulation, which will just make it even more difficult to enforce specific rules with regard to platform workers. Roman, in Germany, how do you see platform work also in the context of simply trade union governance and how trade unions get organized? How is all this digitalization affecting trade unions as well?
Yeah, thanks.
Okay, thank you. So I think one fundamental issue in the world of digital world is the lack of transparency. So we don't really know how the digital systems actually operate, what the bases of these platforms are, how they would, for instance, structure the role of workers within work processes and how they incorporate them. And I suppose the status of workers, it would be a function of that. So is this a matter of being line managed? So there is such a level of intransparency that we really don't know what's going on. And related to that, it's already been mentioned, the question of employment status. At times in Germany, the issue is not actually bogus self-employment, in particular thinking about food delivery service. It's just because somebody is employed and not self-employed doesn't mean that they've got fantastic working conditions. We've got people who can be dismissed at no notice. We've got a lot of subcontracting. We've got high workloads and pressure. The digital surveillance every 10, 15 seconds, drivers are being tracked. So there's constant pressure that leads to increased risks of accidents, and then drivers will often not be sufficiently insured and protected by their employers. So the drivers of Lieferando at the moment are fighting in this particular area. It's about healthcare. It's about social security, but I think one issue that we find across all platforms, forms, we can say there's just a lack of transparency.
Yeah, this is clearly something that comes back, this lack of information. And if I can then go back to Olivier, I mean, you mentioned this level of political support to these big platforms, and you're at the same time in a decision-making function. You're able to fight back certain decisions of this nature. Where do you think you are most able to fight back? Where do you see the most promising work in terms of policy to defend and protect platform workers? How are you building this fighting back in France?
Eh bien, dans l'équation politique française,
in the French political equation, as things stand, when I saw the Schmidt directive, I thought this is our salvation, because France by itself could not fight against the determination of the government to support deregulation. Initially, people on the right in France were very reluctant to think about this third status. And now, since the Schmidt directive has come about, the right, and of course the French presidency was also on the right, are really opposed to the Schmidt directive. So things are becoming clearer in the political landscape. But that said, I'm fairly optimistic because of this directive, and I do hope it will be finalized very quickly in Europe, but I'm already worrying about how it will be transposed in French legislation and the means that will be used to circumvent it and to get around it. So that's how I see things, because seen from the perspective of companies and workers, and it's very interesting to hear what's happening in other countries, but workers are not very unionized, and collective action is quite limited. So looking at cooperatives, this is something that has been presented as promising, and there are good prospects. This is a super trade union organizer in the suburbs of Paris. It was talking about a cooperative that should kick off this fall, where you would have both public and private actors and cooperative members. So in all of our attempts, as early as March 2021, I introduced a bill to talk about the presumption of a worker's status. And this was even before it was done in Spain. And there was also an article on the transparency of algorithms. But so far, we're in the minority. We can't manage to get a majority to get these kinds of regulations. And the liberals, quote unquote, are dominant. Liberals in the sense the free marketers are dominant. So I'm very much in favor of Michael Schmidt and his directive, and let's hope it really comes to pass soon.
Thanks for bringing back the question of the cooperatives, because it was brought up by Ivana in the first panel. I'd like also Nicolas to react to this. I mean, is it a promising type of governance model that could somehow combine the realities of digital platforms and platform working, but at the same time giving sufficient guarantees to workers?
Sì, ci sono delle esperienze in Italia.
Yes, there are a few experiences in Italy. On the one hand, there are the charters of rights that have been approved, and on the other, the workers can get organized. My colleague talked about caregiving. Well, the problem is competition between the platforms organizing the work and the cooperatives that usually are the instrument that is used to manage services that are regulated by an agreement. But it is evident that the challenge is not simple at all, because the same level of technology that platforms are using, and they are a great ability of raising funds on the market. Well, digital platforms have this characteristic. They raise funds. They burn cash, as we tend to say, so they don't immediately realize revenue in their financial statements, but they act as a monopoly, basically, with very aggressive investments in technology, whereas cooperatives are based on ethical principles. So it is important to understand that a competition with these subjects that are so powerful from a financial standpoint is not easy. Maybe it might be with other businesses, it's a bit more complicated when you engage private individuals. And, you know, when private individuals are looking for a service, they always look for the simplest way to get that service. And technology is what is offering now today. Suffice it to see what's happened with e-commerce. So what I believe is that the question of cooperation is definitely a question to address, but we can't think that the regulation of this sector can only depend on the use of these instruments. And another concern I would like to share with you, I would like to hear from you, is that there's a part of the work that is considered to be geographical work, if I may say so. I don't know, food delivery or goods delivery, domestic work, healthcare professions, social workers, where the platform is the intermediary, but there are professionals. There's a consistent part of work that is not only digital work with the help of artificial intelligence, but is what is actually coming to pass with digitalization, where sectors become neutral, professions become neutral. I'm speaking on behalf of the union. We are used to work in-house. We are used to work in businesses, and we have to deal with workers that have no physical place to work, have no working hours, and they operate through a virtual instrument that connects them all through a machine-man interface. It's a very, very complex system that is ending up neutralizing work. So it's a philosophical question, but also a very complex union-related question. And I agree with my colleagues, we need regulations and strong ones, because protections must be built up front. So usually work generates a sort of self-protection through collective processes, and these protections must be built beforehand through prevention. And the role of governments is concerning. I don't want to mention anyone, but if we look at the European picture, only a minority of governments, the so-called bloc minority, is actually working to promote the directive on platforms. and many other countries are actually supporting a deregulation process.
Yeah, you raise an important point there on the capacity of collective action when your work is so individualized and displaced. The employer no longer has the ownership of an instrument of production, but has the ownership of a financial institution, effectively. That's a bit the nature of the relationship here between the employers and the workers. In Greece, we have seen, nevertheless, some collective action. It was also mentioned as a comment or as a question in the audience in relation to the strikes by e-food delivery workers. So there is a capacity to react and to defend one's rights. But how do trade unions then organize their defense line? How do they incorporate some of these collective actions into their own governance, into their own decision making? How do you go about helping in Greece?
Currently, well, when we speak about private education, we talk about two different categories. One category are educators working in private schools under a regime and a status of remuneration and working hours that is similar to the one for educators in the public sector, regardless whether they can be fired, etc. But the big problem that we face has to do with educators that I mentioned earlier, people working in private courses, supportive centers for homework assistance, etc., and those educators for foreign languages. What we have managed following many efforts back in 2016 under the previous government was because there was a collapse of collective agreements in Greece since we had the Troika policy, that is the EU and the European Bank policy did not allow collective agreements. We managed to convince the then government to calculate our work on the basis of 21 hours per week. So instead of 3 euros, which was a miserable pay, we've reached 7 euros. And nowadays, with some increases of the minimum wage, we've reached a gross 9 euros. We're talking about a net 7 to 7.5 euros per hour. Again, this is insufficient to cover the needs. Imagine that if you're working full time, you get a salary of 600 euros almost. So you can imagine what is the situation in digital platforms. Last week, talking to employers' unions, we called them to have collective agreements. And of course, they rejected it. They refused because it's not in the interests of the employers to have collective agreements to increase pay when in the present law, it is not obligatory to seek arbitration. In the past, in Greece, we could resort to an arbitration organization that would issue a ruling that would be binding for both parties. Nowadays, the fact that there is no opportunity for us to engage into collective agreements, despite the pressure that we put together with our primary unions, etc., employers having the alliance of the government of the right, which is a very strong liberal right-wing government, are not going to back down, and they will not accept collective agreements and negotiations. The fact is that these 65,000 people working are a precariat. They live on precarious jobs. They have fixed-term contracts. They work there for a short time, and they try to find another job. This is a moving body of employees, and it's very difficult to trace them and organize them in a union. This might be the biggest challenge for Greek unions. Imagine that although in the private schools, we have a high unionism reaching up to 40% of teachers. 40% of them belong to unions. In the area of foreign languages, etc., this rate is under 0.5%. Imagine that we are talking about 65,000 workers. We live under difficult conditions and circumstances. We do whatever it takes to protect these people. However, as long as there is this condition of the impossibility of drafting collective agreements and collective bargaining, the employers will take advantage of the political coverage by the government and the lack of controls and inspections in the labor market. Of course, what's promising is that the riders in e-food, one of the two large platforms, have established their own union, and they went on strike last year, and this strike was embraced by the Greek society because it was no partisan, but it was rather a strike of a social character, social nature, and quite original. There was a rally with their motorbikes, etc., with very smart logos, etc., very youthful, and they managed to win some things from their employer. Maybe this is a sign to the unions that in Greece, still they are not familiar with the digital platforms. They move traditionally. They haven't fully grasped digital work and platform work, etc. We haven't been able to identify those people working in digital platforms, etc. We need to modernize ourselves and keep abreast with the developments, and we need to try as much as possible to represent these people who nowadays are completely defenseless. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, we understand that this movement. It's very difficult to unionize some sectors, but I see that you're giving it a try. Roman, before I go to you, I will come to you right away. I would just like to go quickly to Olivier because I think he has to leave very soon. And I would like to hear from you, Olivier, on the European perspective. I mean, there's a new directive on platform work being negotiated between Commission, Parliament, and Council. What are your specific demands in relation to this European directive?
D'accord. Déjà, le témoignage de M. Christopoulos, la grecque.
First of all, what our Greek colleague has said is very interesting, and I'm convinced that if there isn't a real struggle or battle organized through the trade unions, we won't get anywhere. Maybe I was too quick in saying this. The post-COVID context in France raises a lot of questions, and it's very hard to understand what is emerging, because what we're seeing is very strong links of subordination and with the objective alliance of some workers who are precarious, who no longer trust the traditional formats of work, and some companies that are trying to take advantage of the crisis to deregulate the work as much as possible and to basically go back on the benefits achieved. So now the directive, well, the only hope I have, or it is the only hope for a significant change. We cannot simply be satisfied with what can be gained through the court system, as regular as it might be. The real perspective is to have this very ambitious directive adopted, because this is how we can hope to protect workers. And for me, this is what we must be focused on, and this is what is being fought for. And we can use some interesting French examples. For instance, the cooperative of some individual drivers. And we have to be very vigilant and not just look at the rider sector, the mobility sector, but the broader digital workers sector. So I'd like to thank you for this question.
Thank you very much, Olivier. And if you have to leave, well, thank you for having also been part of the debate. Thank you so much. Thank you. And I would like then to turn to Roman, if possible. It's going to be a big question for you, Roman, because on the one hand, I'd like you to react on the European level, so some of the demands that you have for this European directive, but also demands that you have as trade unions in Germany in relation to the protection of platform workers. Can you give us a sense of those two levels?
Natürlich.
Yes,
Danke.
of course, gladly.
Als die Kommission 2021
So when the Commission in 2021 introduced the proposal for a directive, we welcomed it because it is all about the status. So what kind of employment are we talking about? And what is the mechanism for the employees? So it's also not about the employee having to prove what sort of status they have. So, but to actually have full transparency on all levels and to see what the employment status is vis-a-vis the platform, because otherwise people don't know what the algorithms are. I don't know what my worth is, what my status is. So that's actually a really important question. And it's a good question. So there's a mechanism that was suggested by the Commission, and that's actually a very strong mechanism. It's a very strong list of points, and it could actually lead to the fact that the platforms are trying to evade this list of points. They may want to change their technology to actually evade the requirements set by the Commission. So it's actually a good thing that the employee can just prove one thing, and then the platform has to be transparent in giving all information about their status. So all the question on transparency of algorithm mechanisms are very well dealt with by the Commission. And it's also really important in the context of trade unions in terms of access to employees on platforms. And I think this is also essential because everything is a little bit dislocated. There's not one place of work as in traditional settings. So we used to be able to go into one company and we used to have one contact person. Nowadays, we're just alone in front of our own computers, or I'm just riding my bike somewhere. So it's actually easier now to organize workers that are riding bikes as well if they have a point of contact and if there is a joint place that they all can be. And as trade unions, I think we also need to see this as positive, to have the position of the parliament, for example, and to see this as real progress. I think trade unions actually played an important role in their lobby work, in spite of all of the headwind we got from employers as well. And it was really a success to get to the position of the parliament. And I feel that it's actually quite a progressive situation and position of the parliament, because if we see if we're real employees, then so it's actually not the fact that they're actually self-employed, but they're properly employed. So I think that's a really good thing, and I really welcome all of these developments. And now we're just waiting for the position of the council. They haven't actually expressed their position yet. And now our task is to keep the pressure high and to make sure that the council also comes to a very progressive position. And then we will arrive at a directive which is easily transposed for companies, and it will strengthen works councils as well. And I think the other question was what has happened in Germany from a trade union point of view. Was that right?
Yes. Yeah. How are you? You know, what are your key demands as trade unions in Germany? Yeah, in the German context.
Also, wie gesagt, ich glaube, es.
Well, as I already said, or I tried to put that across earlier. So there are some problems arising from this new form of work, of digital work. So it's a high level of intransparency. So we need to create transparency via the functioning of digital systems, also to achieve co-determination and to participate in the design of these systems, to set limits, to determine what can be included in those systems and what can't. That really needs to be the subject of those negotiations. So that's one of our key demands beyond platform work as well. And then there's also other problems in a more traditional context. For example, there are developments in terms of outsourcing to sub companies, and the platforms try to shed most of their responsibility. They try to be as flexible as possible. There's also some other things that we're trying to achieve, like liability for parcels services, etc. So there are some general companies, for example, platforms, and they're trying to evade their responsibilities in terms of social contributions as well. And sometimes dismissals without ground are also an issue that we're dealing with at the moment. So sometimes this happens, and that's a problem that platforms were also bringing about, and that's something that we have to work against. So another big topic is high work pressure. So sometimes there's a lot of pressure physically, but also psychologically. And in Germany, so we sometimes people try to capture physical and psychological pressures, and just 1/4 of companies are actually looking at these pressures for their employees. And I think we need some control mechanisms. We need further resources to look at all of these things. And this also needs to apply to the platform sector.
Thank you. Thank you, Roman. Nicolas, on this question of the European level, I mean, I'd like to just challenge you a little bit, or challenge. I mean, I'm not in the detail of these discussions, but you know, if I were to picture the European level, I would say it's, you know, highly in support of a strong digitalization agenda, much more than I would call it a social policy advocate. So I can imagine that there is some hope to look at a European level directive that would create some rules in this market, but do you really think that this will help? And what kind of demands do you have on this policy, on this directive?
Sì, io penso che bisogna avere un approccio positivo.
I think we need to have a positive approach. We've got the European directive on the one hand that is going to be approved, definitely, and will be very helpful. On the other, you can hear me all right, can you? On the other, I believe that unions as well should take a step forward. Platform work will lead to an increase in the number of people that work independently. They will not be considered as subordinate workers. The European directive shall follow along the lines of the guidelines on collective bargaining for self-employed workers, guidelines that have been approved. And the unions must understand how to act collectively to represent workers that are independent and that are no subordinate employment relationships. And this is a challenge we have to rise up to. My colleague, Ivana Pais, was saying that earlier. So the share of self-employment is already pretty consistent. We've got a few million people that have a VAT number. Of course, they are professionals and not only craft workers. That's what I mean. So we need to take a step forward. Also, when it comes to the ability of unions to represent them and to act collectively in favor of workers that have a different way of providing their professional service, bearing in mind that this autonomy is something workers look for. Because it helps them to stay in that profession with different characteristics.
Yep. Okay, I was just wondering if there was a little glitch in translation, but yes, I fully understand. Trade unions can also defend VAT workers. Maybe we can call them something like that. And maybe also then a final word from Georgios in Greece, your expectations and your key demands on a European level directive. I mean, you painted a rather bleak picture of rules and governance in Greece. So do you think the European level can help there? 2 minutes, please, 2 minutes.
I believe that judging from the way the labor law of 2021 is being applied, even the best directive from the EU, in Greece, it will be used in such a way so as for it to be invalid. I think that the only solution to improve the situation and conditions of workers, platform workers and other employees alike is for this government, the present government, not to win the elections. I think it's going to be difficult because most probably they will win the elections. I hope that the unions will keep on their fight to identify platform workers. We have asked the government two things: to have a digital registry that will register the platforms, at least in the area of education, because this is a field where I work. And the second thing is to harmonize the relations of the workers, the industrial relations of workers in platforms with the ones in physical presence, etc. But this is difficult. This is a challenge. There is lack of knowledge and awareness amidst those who work on platforms. In the areas of private platforms, etc., there's a blacklist. If one wants to be better remunerated, they are automatically entered into a blacklist of employers because a large part of workers work in these 4 or 5 large franchises. So we have very strong opponents, I guess. So I think that the change in policy can be achieved only through struggle in society, in community and workers. And I aspire that we will have to improve our fights towards this direction. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Georgios, for those words. There is indeed a struggle on national level. Hopefully you can also take part in a bit of the struggle on European level as well. Probably there will be an interest in doing so too. Thank you, Georgios. Thank you, Nicola, for having shared your insights. Thank you, Roman, for having taken the time as well to be with us. Part of the European response will be in this exchange of information between those who are trying in a complex space, but trying to protect workers in all types of activity and respecting some of their freedoms, but at the same time protecting them from undue risk. Okay, where some of the digital platforms are clearly also making some profits out of that. So thank you so much for having been with us, Roman and Nicola as well. Thank you. And
Grazie mille.
thank you. And thank you to all of you who attended. Thank you to the interpreters as well, who've done a fantastic job, who've kept up with the rhythm. It's not easy over a 2-hour stretch, but I think you did fantastic. And yeah, FES will be following up with event recording information, and I'm sure there will be even more research moving forwards to try and uncover some of these bits of information and data that some digital platforms seem to want to keep a little bit invisible. But this must change. Okay, thank you so much. Good luck and see you next time. Bye-bye.